What drives a man to sail toward the edge of the known world, knowing that the horizon is nothing more than a graveyard of ice? In May 1845, two massive ships, the Erebus and the Terror, departed England, commanded by the seasoned Sir John Franklin. Their goal was the final, elusive link of the Northwest Passage. They carried 129 men, enough provisions for 3 years, and the unshakable arrogance of the Victorian age. They sailed into the Canadian Arctic, vanishing into the white silence as if the earth itself had simply closed over them. For years, the world waited for news that never came. When search parties finally began to peel back the layers of the frozen tomb, they found only fragments of a nightmare. There were no grand records of discovery, only scattered relics, a rusted tin of food, a pile of discarded trinkets, and stories from the local Inuit people of starving men wandering the barren wastes, their eyes hollowed by desperation. What compelled the crew to abandon two sturdy ships, packed with gear, to trek across the jagged, unforgiving ice? Some believe they succumbed to lead poisoning from faulty canned rations, clouding their minds with paranoia. Others whisper of a more primal terror, of something that stalked them through the howling, endless winter nights. To this day, the ships remain mostly hidden, ghosts beneath the crushing weight of the pack ice, holding onto the truth of their final, freezing hours. We look at the map and see empty space, but the Arctic remembers. It remembers the sound of wood splintering against the ice floes and the last breath of 100 men who walked out into the void, never to return. What did they see before the darkness took them? That is a secret the ice refuses to give up. The silence of the Arctic is not merely an absence of sound. It is a predatory weight that presses against the soul. For the crew of the Franklin expedition, the Terror and the Erebus were not just ships, but ironclad fortresses designed to conquer the untamable labyrinth of the Northwest Passage. Yet, as the calendar turned and the polar night deepened, that fortress became a tomb. It started with subtle, unsettling shifts in the routine. Men spoke of voices carried on the biting wind, whispers that sounded like home, yet carried a cadence that was entirely alien to these desolate latitudes. Provisions, meant to last for years, began to reveal a rot that defied explanation, turning preserved supplies into blackened, inedible ash. The first signs of trouble were not the massive icebergs or the crushing pressure of the floes, but a creeping, psychological decay that took hold of the men in the dark. Officers noted in their journals that the crew seemed to be watching the horizon with an intensity that bordered on madness, as if waiting for something to emerge from the endless, blinding white. When the ships became permanently gripped by the frozen sea, the trap finally slammed shut. No rescue could reach them, and the vast, indifferent ice began its slow, suffocating squeeze. What exactly did those men see when they stared out into the crystalline haze of the wasteland? Some believe they were witnessing the very fabric of the landscape shifting, a reality warped by isolation and extreme cold, while others suggest they encountered phenomena that science still refuses to name. One thing remains certain. As the warmth bled from the decks, the whispers grew louder, and the expedition began its slow descent into an abyss from which only shadows would ever return. The ocean has a way of swallowing secrets whole, leaving behind nothing but an endless, churning expanse of gray water. We often talk about the Marie Celeste as the ultimate ghost ship, but history hides even darker voids where entire vessels simply cease to be. Imagine a calm, crystal-clear day in the Atlantic, where two massive, formidable ships, the Cyclops and her sister ship the Nereus, carry thousands of tons of cargo and hundreds of souls toward their destination. They were giants of steel, built to endure the most violent storms, yet they vanished without a single distress signal, a splinter of wreckage, or a floating life vest. In early 1918, the Cyclops disappeared somewhere between Barbados and Baltimore, taking over 300 people into the abyss. Search parties combed the waves for weeks, expecting to find at least some debris, but the sea remained unnaturally silent. What makes this even more unsettling is the fate of its sister ship, the Nereus, which would follow a similar path into oblivion years later. Some believe that the treacherous, shifting currents of the Bermuda Triangle claim these vessels through unexplained gravitational anomalies, while others point towards sudden, catastrophic structural failure, though no evidence of such a flaw was ever found. When you look at the sheer scale of these iron leviathans, the idea that they could be erased from existence in an instant feels like a defiance of reality itself. They did not sink in a storm, they evaporated into the dark. Was it a freak wave of impossible proportions, or did they sail into a pocket of the world where the laws of nature simply stop applying? The ocean keeps its mouth shut, and we are left staring at the horizon, waiting for a wreckage that will never arrive. How does a vessel, engineered to withstand the crushing grip of the Arctic ice, simply vanish into the white void, only to be found decades later as a haunting monument to a frozen nightmare? We often speak of the Franklin expedition as a tragedy of mismanagement, but the discovery of the Terror in 2016 offered a revelation that defies logic. When divers finally descended into the icy depths of Terror Bay, they were met with a sight that felt pulled from a ghost story rather than a historical recovery. The ship was not broken or shattered by the relentless pressure of the pack ice, as many had long assumed. Instead, the Terror sat upright on the seabed, preserved in an eerie state of near perfection. The hatches were battened down, the propellers were intact, and the interior suggested a vessel that had been prepared for a routine journey, not one abandoned in a desperate, dying scramble. Why would a crew, facing starvation and the encroaching cold, leave a ship that was seemingly still structurally sound? Some experts suggest that the crew was forced to abandon ship under a sudden, overwhelming threat that compelled them to walk out onto the ice, leaving behind a fortress of oak and iron. As we look at the silent, dark decks now resting beneath the waves, the cold realization settles in. They were not merely defeated by the elements. They were claimed by something that left the ship untouched, as if the Terror itself was waiting for a crew that would never return. The silence down there is heavy, a lingering witness to a question that the frozen North refuses to answer. What happens to a man when the last shred of civilization is stripped away, leaving only the crushing, silent expanse of the Arctic barrens? We often look to the official logs of the Franklin expedition for answers, searching for logical explanations among the wreckage of ice-locked hulls. But the true, unsettling narrative lies not in the journals of the lost, but in the whispered accounts of those who saw them from the shadows. The Inuit people, who lived in harmony with the frozen landscape for centuries, tell a chilling tale of starving, hollow-eyed men who wandered the wasteland long after the ships had vanished. They speak of strange, gaunt figures dressed in tattered remnants of heavy wool, stumbling across the blinding white tundra like ghosts trapped in a physical realm. These men did not move with the purpose of explorers. They moved with the vacant desperation of souls who had already crossed the threshold. The Inuit reported encounters with these survivors, noting that their eyes were glazed, as if they were looking at something no living person should see. Some suggest these were the final, delirious survivors of the Terror and the Erebus, driven to the brink of sanity by the biting cold and the gnawing hunger that eats the mind before the body. Why were they so far from their encampments, and what drove them to march endlessly into the void? To the Inuit, these were not just men anymore. They were manifestations of a deep, ancient curse etched into the permafrost. The accounts persist, haunting and specific, suggesting that for those final weeks, the expedition did not just die, it withered into something unrecognizable, wandering the edge of the world until the ice finally claimed the last of their voices. We are left with a lingering, shivering question. Were they truly still looking for a way home, or were they running from something else entirely, something lurking in the silence of the barrens? What forces a group of seasoned, rational men to abandon the relative sanctuary of a solid vessel and march into a frozen, unforgiving void? When the crew of the Franklin expedition finally chose to leave their ice-locked ships, the Erebus and the Terror, they were not just stepping onto the Arctic ice. They were stepping into a nightmare that has defied explanation for nearly 2 centuries. Imagine the scene: the relentless, howling wind clawing at your face, the temperature plummeting far below what the human body is designed to endure, and the knowledge that the nearest sign of civilization is hundreds of miles of jagged, shifting white death away. Why would officers and sailors, trained to survive against the odds, decide that their only hope lay in abandoning the very structure that had sheltered them? Some historians point to the sheer desperation of lead poisoning or the ravages of scurvy, suggesting their minds had succumbed to a slow, agonizing decay. Others speculate that they were gripped by a collective, mounting dread, a belief that something, perhaps something ancient and hidden within the permafrost, had begun to hunt them from the shadows of the pack ice. There is a haunting madness in the discarded wreckage they left behind: scattered belongings, heavy navigational instruments abandoned in the snow, and tales of men carrying items that served no purpose for survival. They walked into a white abyss, leaving behind not just their ships, but their own humanity, marching toward a conclusion that remains as cold and silent as the grave. What were they running from, or perhaps, What were they being pulled toward? When they turned their backs on the safety of the iron hulls and vanished into the endless winter, imagine standing on a desolate, wind-scoured stretch of gravel in the Canadian Arctic, where the air is so cold it feels like shards of glass in your lungs. This is Beechey Island, a silent graveyard at the edge of the known world. In 1845, Sir John Franklin set sail with two formidable ships, the Erebus and the Terror, carrying 129 men into the frozen labyrinth of the Northwest Passage. They were never seen alive again. When rescue parties finally stumbled upon this island years later, they found a chilling, perfectly preserved time capsule that defied logic. 3 graves stood in the biting frost, marked by weathered wooden headboards. When researchers exhumed the bodies in the 1980s, the horror was not in the decay, but in the lack of it. Beneath the permafrost, John Torrington, William Braine, and John Hartnell lay as if they had simply fallen asleep hours before. Their skin was pale, their features hauntingly discernible, preserved by the glacial temperatures in a state of suspended animation. But what killed them? While some suggest lead poisoning from faulty food tins, others point to the inexplicable desperation that drove the expedition to ruin. Scattered around the site were hundreds of empty canisters and remnants of a life interrupted, yet the ships themselves had vanished into the shifting ice. To this day, the sight of those frozen, watchful faces serves as a grim reminder that some secrets are meant to be swallowed by the ice forever. Why did they abandon their sanctuary? And what nightmare forced them into the white void from which no one returned? The wind still howls over their graves, but the Arctic refuses to whisper the truth of their final hours. What happens when the hunters become the prey, not of beasts or men, but of an invisible, silent decay? We turn our gaze back to the frost-bitten wastes of the Arctic, specifically the remnants left behind by the ill-fated Franklin expedition. When search parties finally stumbled upon the scattered debris of the Erebus and Terror, they did not find a battlefield or signs of a swift end. Instead, they found a haunting tableau of domestic collapse. Among the heaps of discarded metal scraps and hundreds of broken, twisted food cans, investigators uncovered a secret that had been gnawing at the crew long before the ships were locked in the crushing embrace of the ice. The soldering on these tins was botched, leaking lead into the very sustenance that was meant to keep the men alive in the sub-zero hell. Some historians argue this slow poisoning induced a steady mental and physical deterioration, turning the once hardened explorers into shadows of themselves. But look closer at the scattered gear and the strange arrangement of the remains. The lead was present, yes, but does it account for the sheer, frantic desperation etched into the scene? There is an eerie stillness to these rusted relics, a silent testament to a sickness that clouded the mind before it stopped the heart. Was it merely the metal that doomed them, or did the Arctic itself conspire to unravel their sanity long before the final breath was drawn? The broken cans lie frozen in the permafrost, holding the memory of a slow, agonizing dissolution that history still struggles to fully comprehend. How much of a human life are we willing to sacrifice in the pursuit of a truth that refuses to be found? For decades, the silence surrounding these vanishing acts has acted as a cold, suffocating shroud. We send out search parties, we pore over weathered maps, and we cling to the tattered remnants of last journals, yet the earth and the sea remain stubbornly mute. Consider the explorers who vanished into the frozen maw of the Arctic or the vessels that drifted into the fog, never to emerge. The search for these answers has become a generational obsession, a cycle of hope followed by the crushing weight of futility. Year after year, investigators return to the same coordinates, hoping that the shifting sands or the retreating ice might finally yield a scrap of evidence, a rusted compass, a splintered timber, or a name carved into stone. But instead, they find only more questions. The geography itself seems to conspire against us, burying the past under layers of impenetrable mystery. Some believe these disappearances are merely the result of cruel natural chaos, a sudden storm, a misplaced step, or a navigational error in the dark. Others look at the eerie lack of bodies and wreckage and wonder if something far more anomalous is at play, something that defies our understanding of reality. Yet, the ocean floors and the deep forests keep their counsel, offering no closure to the grieving families and no respite for the historians. We are left staring into a void that has swallowed history whole, realizing that some secrets were never meant to be retrieved from the shadows of time. The silence is not just an absence of sound. It is a wall standing firm against our desperate need to know what truly happened in those final, terrifying moments. What happens to a man when the ice begins to whisper, and the relentless Arctic wind carries the sound of voices that should not be there. We travel back to 1845 to the ill-fated Franklin expedition, where two state-of-the-art ships, the Erebus and the Terror, vanished into the frozen maw of the Canadian Arctic. They were searching for the Northwest Passage, a path to glory, but they found only a silent, shivering grave. For years, the world wondered why over 100 seasoned explorers simply ceased to exist. When the first rescue parties finally unearthed the truth, it was far more harrowing than a simple shipwreck. They found graves, hastily dug, shallow pits containing the brittle, frozen remains of men who had stepped off their ships into a nightmare. Forensic examinations conducted over a century later revealed something deeply disturbing in their marrow: high levels of lead poisoning, likely from their own canned rations, which would have rotted their minds and dissolved their resolve. Yet that is merely a medical footnote. The Inuit legends tell a darker story, one of starving men wandering the wastes, their sanity fraying like thin rope, moving in circles through the blinding white void. Some believe they were driven by a madness that forced them to abandon all discipline. When you stand in that desolate expanse today, looking out at the crushing ice, you cannot help but wonder, did they succumb to the cold, or did something within that infinite, biting silence finally break them, leaving them to wander until the snow claimed their names forever? Imagine a place so desolate that even the wind seems to hold its breath, a vast, indifferent expanse of shifting ice where the boundary between the earth and the frozen heavens dissolves into a singular, blinding white. We are talking about the final, icy grave of the Franklin expedition, a tragedy that has haunted the Arctic circles for over a century and a half. In 1845, two majestic ships, the Erebus and the Terror, set sail from England with the most advanced maritime technology of the Victorian era, aiming to conquer the Northwest Passage. They carried over 100 men, seasoned explorers equipped for the harshest conditions imaginable. Yet they vanished into that white silence as if the map itself had decided to erase them. For years, the world was left to wonder, how could two gargantuan vessels, built of iron and oak, simply cease to exist? When search parties finally began to unearth the grim reality, they found scattered remnants of a desperate struggle, tins of food left behind, personal belongings discarded in the snow, and tales from local Inuit populations of starving men stumbling blindly across the ice. Some believe the crews were driven to madness by lead poisoning or the crushing weight of isolation, while others point to the eerie, sudden onset of unnatural storms. When the wrecks were finally located decades ago, they sat upright on the seafloor, preserved in the freezing depths like silent wooden tombs. They hold the secrets of their final hours within their rotting hulls, yet they offer no solace, only a chilling reminder that in the infinite loneliness of the poles, nature does not negotiate, and silence is the only witness that remains. What did those men see in their final, freezing moments as the light faded into the long, dark polar night? We may never truly know. Imagine a landscape where the horizon bleeds into the white of the sky, a place where time itself seems to freeze alongside the shifting glaciers. In 1845, Sir John Franklin set sail from England with two state-of-the-art ships, the Erebus and the Terror, manned by over 100 men, determined to conquer the Northwest Passage. They were the pride of the British Empire, equipped for years of survival in the Arctic wild. Yet, they vanished into the silent, suffocating grip of the North, leaving behind only whispers carried by the freezing wind. For years, the world wondered what became of those brave souls. When search parties finally began to unearth the truth, they found a nightmare etched in bone and silence. Scavenged remains, rusted tins of food, and relics of a desperate, agonizing crawl across the ice told a harrowing story of failure. But the true mystery lies in the details that defy logic. Inuit accounts spoke of men staggering through the snow, their minds unraveling, doing things that made no sense to those who lived in harmony with the frost. Some theories suggest that lead poisoning from faulty canned supplies clouded their judgment, while others whisper of a psychological collapse so profound it drove them to madness. Why did they abandon perfectly sturdy ships to walk into their own graves? We see them in our minds, shadows against the blinding white, shivering in the grip of a cold that defies description. To this day, the deep frost guards its secrets, and the echoes of Franklin's men remain trapped in the ice, a haunting reminder that in the face of nature's absolute cruelty, even the greatest human ambition can simply cease to be. Deep beneath the rolling waves of the Atlantic, far from the reach of sunlight and the clamor of the modern world, lie secrets that have haunted mariners for centuries. Imagine a silent, pressurized realm where time itself seems to stand still, and the ocean floor serves as a graveyard for history's most baffling enigmas. We often look to the stars for answers, yet the true mysteries are buried in the silt of the abyss, guarding tales of ships that vanished without a trace and civilizations that were swallowed whole by the rising tides. How can a massive vessel, sturdier than any craft of its time, simply cease to exist, leaving no wreckage, no debris, and no survivors to tell the tale? Some researchers point to sudden, violent tectonic shifts or colossal underwater landslides that can rearrange the seafloor in a heartbeat, erasing all evidence of human presence. Others whisper of strange, localized currents that pull objects down into abyssal trenches, hiding them forever beneath miles of crushing dark. We explore the hushed reports of strange anomalies detected by early sonar, echoes that resemble the architecture of cities long forgotten, structures that defy the known capabilities of ancient engineers. The ocean is not merely a body of water. It is a vault, an indifferent guardian of the forgotten, where the deeper you descend, the more reality begins to fray at the edges, leaving us with nothing but cold, salty shadows and the unsettling feeling that we were never meant to disturb what rests upon the seabed. Have you ever wondered what happens when a man ventures into the frozen maw of the world, only to find that the earth itself refuses to let him leave? We look at the map and see empty white spaces, but history knows them as graveyards. In the mid-19th century, Sir John Franklin set sail with two magnificent ships, the Erebus and the Terror, intending to conquer the Northwest Passage. They were the pride of the British Empire, equipped with the finest supplies and hardened crews, yet they vanished into the Arctic silence as if swallowed by the ice itself. Years later, search parties began to uncover the grim truth, not in the form of logs or maps, but in scattered fragments of bone and rusted metal left across the desolate barrens of King William Island. Inuit witnesses spoke of starving, ghost-like men dragging lifeboats over the frozen tundra, their minds broken by scurvy and the crushing pressure of an endless, suffocating winter. Some suggest that lead poisoning from faulty canned rations turned these seasoned explorers into shadows of themselves, stripping away their sanity long before the cold took their breath. Others whisper of something far more primal, pointing to the strange, jagged marks left on those scattered remains, marks that suggest a desperate, final resort when the hunt for food failed. They were searching for a path to glory, but they found only a landscape that demanded a sacrifice. As you listen to the howling wind outside your window tonight, imagine those men, abandoned by hope, wandering through a landscape that keeps its secrets locked beneath leagues of permafrost. They became part of the Arctic landscape, their final resting places marked only by the shifting snow. What really happened in those final, desperate hours when the map ran out? The ice never tells. What lies beneath the shifting, bone-crushing ice of the high Arctic, where the horizon bleeds into a singular, frozen void? We have spent centuries hurling our best ships and bravest souls into this desolate white maw, only to watch them vanish as if swallowed by the earth itself. The Franklin expedition, the Jeannette, and the countless whalers who never returned home remain locked in a glacial tomb, their fates whispered only by the howling, relentless polar winds. Some believe the Arctic acts as a living sentinel, guarding secrets far older than our maps, while others suggest that certain frozen latitudes hold anomalies that defy the laws of nature as we understand them. Are these disappearances merely the result of brutal cold and crushing ice, or does the North contain something else? A silent, ancient power that resents the intrusion of man? We have recovered artifacts, scattered relics of long-lost wooden hulls, yet the men who manned them are gone, leaving behind only fractured logs and haunting, empty cabins. As the permafrost recedes and the ice shelves fracture, we find ourselves standing on the precipice of a revelation. Will the Arctic ever truly surrender its final secret, or are we destined to remain forever guessing, haunted by the shadows of those who walked into the frost and never came back? The truth is drifting in the dark, icy depths, waiting for a dawn that may never come.